So back to the notes. Let's just recap really quickly. Our distance formula is a massive square root. We have a very, very big square root. Everything's inside that square root. Open parentheses. We take the second x, subtract the first x, close the parentheses, and square it. And then we add, so that is sort of our a squared. Now our b squared is our second y minus our first y and squared as well. And all of that is within the square root because that's what you had to do with Pythagorean theorem as well, was take the square root. Okay, we're going to come back to this midpoint formula box in just a little bit, but I wanted to just do a quick practice just so you're familiar, so you can write this in. So we'll use the distance formula here, massive square root. Sometimes I like to just go ahead and draw the whole thing so that I have it all set up. You'll notice that everything is here. I just need to plug in numbers, right? So I did a massive square root, parentheses, squareds, a plus in the middle, but subtraction signs in the parentheses. So if you need to, label your points. So this is x1 and this is x2. So if it's x2 is negative 3, I'm going to take negative 3 minus 5, right? Negative 3 minus 5. And then come back to my y's. This is y1 and this is y2. So also negative 3 minus 1 in this case. So if we simplify, to be very honest with you, if you have the Desmos app open, you can go ahead and type that entire thing into the Desmos app as you see it. But I would encourage you, just to be safe, to type in everything underneath the radical first. So without the square root. So in this one, I'm going to do no square root, right? I'm just going to have no square root. I'm just going to type everything underneath it. You'll see why I do that in just a second. So it's the square root, it's the parentheses of negative 3 minus 5, close parentheses, squared, plus parentheses, negative 3 minus 1, close parentheses, squared. So that gives me 80. And what I can do now is simply type in the square root of 80, right? So what that allows me to do is to, if it's not a perfect square, 80 is not, I can see what it would have been before just getting that decimal. Had you typed it in, I'll show you, I'll copy and paste here. Had you typed it in with the square root already, it would just give you the decimal right off the bat, and you wouldn't actually be able to know what that number was underneath it. So had you just had this third box here, you wouldn't actually know what that number was. So I like you to know what number you're plugging into the square root. So in this case, it's 80, which means the distance of this between these 2 points is going to be approximately, we'll write down both of these. So it's going to be the square root of 80, which was approximately 8.9, I believe is what it said. Yep, 8.94. So we'll leave it at 8.9. Okay? If you want to try question B, you can. Question C is a big one because what we're about to do, and this is something that's coming soon, is to ask what the perimeter of our triangle is. All right? We're going to practice this a bit more tomorrow. So I'm going to skip it and move on for just a second. But as a quick little hint, I would draw a triangle, whatever it looks like. If you have graph paper, you can use graph paper, or I'm going to teach you a pretty cool way to do it on Desmos tomorrow. But you want to make sure you can find these distances. So you'd actually have to find the distance 3 times. Distance number 1, distance number 2, distance number 3, and then add them all together, right? That would be the only way to find the perimeter of that triangle, something we will be practicing. What I want to spend more of our time on now is the midpoint formula. So the midpoint formula, again, as we talked about earlier, it finds the exact middle of our 2 points. So we already did the distance formula. That one we already did earlier. So go back to the top of your notes, the midpoint formula. And the midpoint formula is a point. It's a point. So because it's a point, it's inside a massive parentheses, right? I'll do that in 2 different colors so that you don't get confused with that blue line. But it is a massive coordinate, so we're going to go ahead and put those parentheses in. If you want to go ahead and write a little comma there as well, you can. Because that's precisely what we're doing here, is we're finding a point, a coordinate, in between 2 other coordinates. So Those two other coordinates, we don't know what they are, so let's call them x1 and comma y1, right? x1 comma y1 and x2 comma y2, just like we used for the distance formula. But if we're going to find the midpoint between these two guys, what we need to actually do is take the 2x coordinates. Last time we subtracted them to find the distance, but now we're actually going to add them. You take your two x's, so x1 and x2, whatever they are, and you add them together. Do the same thing for your y's. Take y1 and y2 and add them together. y1 plus y2. And then for both of them, you're going to divide them by 2. What you're actually doing here, if this goes back to Unit 4, is you're actually finding the average or the mean of the x's and the average or the mean of the y's. So that right there is your midpoint formula. You add your x's, divide by 2, add your y's, divide by 2. That's your midpoint. So in the next couple of questions, we're going to practice putting that midpoint formula to good use. All right, let's try this one. So we're just going to do a couple here. The midpoint between here, if you need to, go label these two coordinates. So this would be x1 and this would be x2. All right, never do x1, x2 in the same coordinate. It always has to be an x and a y. So x1, y1. So y1 and y2. And we can plug this straight into our massive parentheses. Sort of like the time before, I like setting this up just so I have everything built and it's ready to go. So I've got it all set up. Let's just plug our numbers in. Our x1 is -2 plus 10 and 6 plus -8. If we simplify a little bit, we're going to be left with -2 plus 10 is 8. So that's 8 over 2, comma 6 plus -8 is -2. So -2 over -2, excuse me, over 2, which then gives me 4, comma -1. That is the midpoint of those 2 points. So take a second, try out B, see if it makes sense to you. But that's how we put the midpoint to use, making sure we can find that point in the middle using our midpoint formula.